And with everything that happened to me, I realized that, I want to keep what's happening to me, this change of life.
He was one of the biggest stars of the 1950s and 60s, a teen idol, a chart-topping songwriter, and the man behind some of music's most iconic hits. But while the world sang along to his melodies, few knew the personal struggles happening behind the scenes. Today, at 84, Paul Anka's life looks very different, and not in the way most would expect. Join us as we take a closer look at the rise, the fame, and the heartbreaking reality of how Paul Anka lives today. Born into secrets. Paul Anka was born on July 30th, 1941 in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He grew up in a close-knit and loving family in the city's vibrant Lebanese community. His father, Andrew "Andy" Anka, was a well-known local businessman who owned a restaurant called the Locanda. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was a popular gathering spot for many people in the neighborhood. His mother, Camelia Tanis Anka, stayed home and took care of the family. She made sure the house was filled with love, warmth, and culture. Paul was the oldest of 3 children and grew up with a younger brother and sister. Being the oldest meant that Paul often felt a deep sense of responsibility, and from an early age he was determined to make something of himself. The Anka household was rich in traditions and values. His parents were both of Lebanese descent and proud of their heritage. They kept their culture alive through music, food, and storytelling. Their home was always busy, filled with laughter, family visits, and lively conversations. One important part of their life was the St. Elijah Syrian Orthodox Church in Ottawa. The church wasn't just a religious place, it was a cultural hub. It brought the Lebanese community together and gave Paul his first formal experience with music. At the age of 11, he started singing in the church choir. It was here that he first began to find his voice and gain confidence performing in front of people. Outside the church, Paul also found inspiration at his father's restaurant. Many musicians and entertainers would come in to eat and perform. Paul would often sit and listen, fascinated by the way they played music and interacted with the crowd. These early moments had a strong impact on him. He wasn't just enjoying the music, he was studying it, learning how rhythm, melody, and emotion all came together. Paul's love for music quickly grew into something more serious. He started teaching himself how to play instruments. Without formal lessons, he learned how to play both the piano and guitar by ear and through practice. He had a natural curiosity and drive that pushed him to improve. He didn't need someone to push him, he already knew what he wanted. As a boy, he also had musical heroes who helped shape his taste. He admired big names like Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and Patti Page. Their smooth voices, emotional delivery, and timeless songs left a big mark on him. Listening to them, he learned about the power of a good song and how music could make people feel deeply. By the time he was a teenager, Paul Anka already knew that music would be his future. What started in the church and around the dinner table had now become a full passion that he couldn't ignore. And just wait, because his big break came sooner than anyone expected. Fame at 16. Paul Anka's journey from a regular teenager in Ottawa to an international music sensation happened quickly. But it wasn't by accident. From a very young age, Paul had big dreams and was determined to make them come true. He wasn't the kind of kid who just hoped for success. He went after it. At just 14 years old, Paul convinced his parents to let him travel to Los Angeles to visit his uncle, Maurice Tanis. Maurice was already involved in the entertainment business, and Paul knew that this trip could open doors for him. He wanted to learn everything he could about music and the industry, and Los Angeles was the perfect place to start. During his time there, Paul made every effort to get closer to the music scene. He visited radio stations and recording studios and met as many people as he could. He wasn't just being social, he was studying, observing, and pushing to be noticed. One of the most important moments of that trip was his meeting with Don Costa, who worked as an arranger and AANDR man for ABC Paramount Records. Costa listened to some of Paul's early songs and saw potential in the young teenager. He was impressed not just by Paul's singing voice, but by his songwriting skills and confidence. Paul was soon signed to the label. His first single, titled Blau Wild d'Everest Fontaine, was released in 1956. Unfortunately, it didn't make much of a splash. It failed to chart, and didn't grab the attention of the public. But Paul wasn't discouraged. He believed in himself and knew he could do better. That belief paid off just 1 year later. In 1957, Paul wrote a song that would change his life forever. It was called Diana, and it was inspired by a real person, a girl he had a crush on who was 5 years older than him. The song captured the feelings of young love, heartache, and longing in a way that felt honest and relatable. When Diana was released, it became an instant hit. It reached #1 on the Billboard charts and went on to sell over 10 million copies worldwide. At just 16 years old, Paul Anka had become a star. With the success of Diana, Paul was suddenly famous all over the world. But he didn't stop there. He followed up with more hit songs that cemented his place in pop music history. Songs like You Are My Destiny, Lonely Boy, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, and Puppy Love were all major successes. Each one had its own message, but they all touched on feelings that teenagers everywhere could understand. Falling in love, feeling alone, and dreaming about the future. Paul's lyrics were simple but powerful, and his smooth voice gave them even more emotion. These songs didn't just climb the charts. They became part of the daily lives of young people. Teenagers played his records at home, danced to his songs at school events, and wrote his lyrics in their notebooks. Paul had become more than a singer. He was a voice for an entire generation of young people. Even with all this fame, Paul still had to balance school and his growing career. He was still attending Fisher Park High School in Ottawa while performing and writing music. That wasn't easy, but Paul stayed focused. He also formed a vocal group with some of his friends called the Bobby Soxers. They performed at local shows and school events, giving Paul early experience in performing live. These performances helped shape his stage presence and prepared him for the much bigger audiences he would soon face. By the end of the 1950s, Paul Anka was one of the biggest teen idols in the world. His songs were played on radios across the globe. He was touring regularly, making television appearances, and continuing to write new music. His fame came fast, but it wasn't by luck. It was because of his hard work, his talent, and his ability to connect with people through music. And things were just getting started. His next chapter would take him from teen star to respected songwriter for some of the biggest names in music. Songwriter beyond the spotlight. While most people remember Paul Anka for his own hit songs like Diana and Put Your Head on My Shoulder, many don't realize that he also built an incredible career writing songs for other artists. Even when he wasn't front and center on stage or on the radio, Paul Anka was working behind the scenes, creating music that helped define other stars' careers. His talent for songwriting went far beyond his own voice. One of his most well-known songs written for another artist was It Doesn't Matter Anymore. Paul wrote it in 1959 for Buddy Holly, who was already a major figure in early rock and roll at the time. The song had a soft, sad tone and talked about the end of a relationship, something many people could relate to. Holly recorded the song, and it was released just weeks before his tragic death in a plane crash. After Holly passed away, the song became a posthumous hit and one of his most beloved tracks. Paul Anka donated all the royalties from the song to Holly's widow. This not only showed Paul's generosity, but it also showed how much he respected the artists he worked with. Another big success came in 1971 when Paul wrote She's a Lady for Tom Jones. Unlike the soft ballads Paul was known for singing himself, She's a Lady had a bold, upbeat sound that matched Tom Jones's powerful voice and lively stage style. The song was a perfect fit. It became one of Tom Jones's biggest hits and a staple in his performances. This proved that Paul had the ability to write songs in many different styles, not just his own. In addition to writing hit songs for other singers, Paul Anka also made a lasting mark on television. In 1962, he composed Johnny's Theme, the instrumental opening theme for The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. This catchy piece of music played every night for over 30 years during Carson's run as host. It became one of the most familiar pieces of music in American television history. Even though most viewers may not have known it was written by Paul Anka, it showed just how far his influence reached. He had written something that became part of people's daily lives without needing his name in lights. As the music industry changed in the 1960s and 70s, many of Paul's fellow teen idols started to fade away. Rock and roll became louder, Trends moved fast, and fans' tastes shifted. But Paul didn't disappear. Instead, he adapted. He kept writing songs that fit the moment, whether they were for himself or for other singers. He was flexible and smart, always thinking ahead. This ability to grow with the industry kept him relevant, even as styles and sounds changed around him. But even after proving himself in the studio and on TV, Paul had even bigger plans for the future, and one of them involved a music legend named Frank, being Sinatra's shadow. One of the most important and meaningful relationships in Paul Anka's life was with Frank Sinatra. As a teenager, Paul looked up to Sinatra. He admired his voice, his confidence, and the way he carried himself on stage. To Paul, Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was the definition of what it meant to be a star. When Paul finally had the chance to meet him in the late 1950s, it was a dream come true. Even though Sinatra was already a major celebrity and Paul was still very young, the two hit it off. Sinatra saw something special in Paul. He liked that Paul was serious about music, hardworking, and respectful. Over time, their connection grew into a real friendship. Sinatra welcomed Paul into his world, introducing him to people in the industry and inviting him to dinners, shows, and personal gatherings. Paul became part of Sinatra's inner circle, something that wasn't easy to do. Sinatra was known for keeping a tight group of friends, and if he didn't trust someone, they weren't allowed in. But Paul earned that trust. He wasn't just a fan, he was a friend and, eventually, a creative partner. The strongest link between the two came in 1968 when Paul wrote My Way for Sinatra. It all started when Paul was on a trip to France and heard a song called Comme d'habitude, which means as usual in French. He liked the melody but felt the lyrics didn't fit Sinatra's style. Paul bought the rights to the music and went back to his hotel room. That night he wrote entirely new English lyrics that reflected Sinatra's life, personality, and career. Paul didn't just write a song, he created something deeply personal for Sinatra. My Way talked about living life with no regrets, doing things on your own terms, and staying true to yourself. When Sinatra heard the song, he immediately connected with it. It felt like it had been written just for him because it had. Sinatra recorded My Way in 1969, and it became one of his signature songs. It was played at his concerts, at public events, and even at his funeral. For many people, it came to define who Frank Sinatra was. For Paul Anka, My Way was one of his proudest achievements. He had written many hit songs before, but this one was different. It wasn't just a commercial success, it had deep emotional meaning. The song helped strengthen his bond with Sinatra and showed the world that Paul was more than just a pop singer. He was a skilled and thoughtful songwriter who could write for anyone. Their friendship went far beyond music. Over the years, Paul and Frank shared many personal moments. Sinatra gave Paul advice about the business, about fame, and about how to handle pressure. They ate meals together, spent time with each other's families, and shared stories about their lives. Paul often spoke about how much he learned from Sinatra, not just about music, but about being a man in the spotlight. Even as Sinatra got older and his health started to decline, Paul stayed close. He remained loyal and continued to visit him and support him. When Sinatra passed away in 1998, Paul was deeply affected. It was the loss of a friend, a mentor, and someone who had played a big role in his life. To this day, Paul Anka often performs My Way in concert and dedicates it to Sinatra. He tells the story of how the song came to be and what Sinatra meant to him. The connection between the two is something Paul continues to honor, and he wrote about it in detail in his autobiography, My Way. In the book, he shares behind-the-scenes stories, private memories, and the full truth of what their friendship meant to him. Their bond was real, lasting, and one of the most powerful parts of Paul Anka's life and career. Next up is how Paul managed to survive the wild changes in the music world while others quickly disappeared. Surviving the music landscape. The 1960s and 1970s were a time of huge change in the music world. For many artists who found success in the 1950s, it was a tough period. Rock music became louder and edgier, and the British invasion, led by bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, took over the charts. Teen idols from the previous decade were quickly pushed aside as younger fans looked for something new. For Paul Anka, this could have been the end of the road, but instead of giving up, he found new ways to stay in the game. One of Paul's greatest strengths was his ability to adapt. He knew the music world was changing, but he also knew who he was as an artist. He didn't try to copy the newer acts or change his image completely. Instead, he stayed true to himself while exploring new directions behind the scenes. He focused more on songwriting and producing, using his experience and knowledge to help other artists succeed. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Paul wrote music for a wide range of performers, including big names like Tom Jones and Frank Sinatra. While some singers from his generation faded away, Paul stayed active by creating new songs for rising stars. This allowed him to remain part of the industry, even if his own name wasn't always on the front of the record. His ability to write in different styles and for different voices made him a valuable figure in the business. Paul also found new success in adult contemporary music. As pop music evolved, so did its audience. Many people who had grown up listening to Paul's early hits were now adults, and they still wanted music that spoke to them. Paul's smooth voice and emotional lyrics were a perfect fit for this market. He started to appear more on adult radio stations and in venues that catered to an older crowd. Another important move Paul made was returning to live performance. He began doing regular shows in Las Vegas, where classic entertainers were always in demand. Vegas audiences appreciated Paul's polished style, and he became a popular act in the city. His shows featured his hits, new material, and stories from his career. These performances helped him keep a strong connection with his fans, even as his radio presence declined. And just when people thought they'd seen everything from Paul Anka, he surprised them again with a bold new musical project, Broken at Home. Behind Paul Anka's long and successful career was a personal life that was often far more complicated. While he became one of the most recognized names in music, his relationships, marriages, and family life were filled with challenges. Fame brought him attention and opportunity, but it also brought pressure, and over time, that pressure affected the people closest to him. Paul's first marriage was to Anne de Zogeb, a former model of Lebanese, French, and English descent. They met in the early 1960s and got married in 1963. At the time, Paul was still a major star, touring constantly and continuing to write and perform music. The couple had 5 daughters together: Alexandra, Amanda, Alicia, Anthea, and Amelia. For a while, they managed to balance family life with Paul's demanding schedule, but it wasn't easy. Paul was often on the road, performing in different cities and countries. The time away from home created distance, and the stress of being in the public eye added to the strain. Despite their efforts to hold things together, the relationship began to wear down. After 37 years of marriage, Paul and Anne divorced in 2000. Though the split was not filled with the kind of drama that would come later, it marked the end of a major chapter in Paul's life. He often spoke fondly of Anne and their time together, but also admitted that his career had taken a toll on their marriage. After his divorce from Anne, Paul entered a very different and far more public relationship with Swedish model and personal trainer Anna Aberg. They were married in 2008, but the marriage quickly turned rocky. Their relationship became the subject of media attention, especially as private matters became public. The couple had a son together, named Ethan, but just 2 years after marrying, Paul and Anna divorced in 2010. This time, the separation was much more difficult. What followed was a long and emotional custody battle over Ethan. The legal fight was highly publicized, with both sides making serious claims in court. Paul fought hard for custody, believing he could offer his son a more stable life. After years of legal battles, Paul was awarded sole custody of Ethan in 2017, a rare outcome, especially in a high-profile case. He later described the decision as one of the most important victories of his life, showing just how committed he was to being a present and responsible father. Following that difficult chapter, Paul's romantic life remained complicated. He had other relationships, but none that lasted long-term. Some close to him have said that the emotional toll of his marriages, divorces, and the custody battle left him deeply affected. In interviews over the years, Paul has hinted at feelings of regret and emotional exhaustion. While he never stopped performing or writing, his personal life became more private. In his later years, Paul Anka started to pull away from the spotlight. He continued to do shows occasionally, but he wasn't as visible as he once was. He rarely did major interviews, and he stopped attending many public events. Friends and fans noticed that he seemed more withdrawn. Some reports suggested that he had become estranged from certain family members, though he remained close to his son, Ethan. Paul has shared in a few interviews that he often feels alone. He's talked about how fame, while exciting, also isolated him from people. Maintaining long-term personal connections became difficult as his life revolved around travel, rehearsals, and public appearances. Now, in his 80s, Paul spends much more time at home, focusing on his health and his son. His life, once filled with crowds and applause, is now quieter. Still, Paul never stopped working, and soon he'd surprise everyone with a creative comeback no one saw coming. Late career moves and fleeting comebacks. As Paul Anka entered the later stages of his career, he never fully stepped away from music. While his time at the top of the pop charts was long behind him, he continued to find ways to stay connected to his fans and to the industry he had helped shape. His performances, projects, and recordings in the 2000s and 2010s showed that he still had something to say, even if his audience had grown older along with him. Las Vegas remained an important part of Paul's career during this time. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, he continued to perform regularly in casinos and theaters across the city. These shows drew loyal fans who had grown up with his music, as well as new audiences curious to see a living legend. While he wasn't performing with the same frequency as he did in his younger years, he still brought energy and charm to every stage appearance. Into his 80s, Paul remained active, doing selected tours across North America and internationally. His concerts were often filled with nostalgia, storytelling, and classic hits, offering something both heartfelt and timeless. In 2005, Paul took a creative leap that surprised many with his album Rock Swings. The album featured modern rock and pop songs reinterpreted in a big band swing-style arrangement. He covered unexpected choices like Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, Oasis's Wonderwall, and Soundgarden's Black Hole Sun. It was a bold idea, taking songs from the grunge and alternative rock era and giving them a completely different musical feel. The album received mostly positive reviews from critics. Many praised Paul's ability to bring a fresh, jazzy style to songs that were never meant for that format. Still, the album had a niche appeal. It didn't become a commercial blockbuster, but it found a dedicated audience and reminded people that Paul Anka was still creatively curious. Though these comebacks didn't launch a full return to the spotlight, they added meaningful chapters to a career that had already spanned decades. Paul Anka alone at 84. Now 84 years old, Paul Anka lives a much quieter life than he once did. After decades of performing, writing, and traveling the world, he has slowed down. While he still makes occasional appearances and does select performances, they are few and far between. The days of constant touring and recording are behind him. His schedule today is more relaxed and focused on personal well-being rather than professional achievement. He rarely gives interviews anymore. When he does speak publicly, it's often reflective and thoughtful. He's open about how it feels to grow older in an industry that constantly chases the new. There's a sadness in his voice when he talks about today's music scene. He doesn't criticize it harshly, but he admits he doesn't feel like he belongs in it anymore. The artists, the sounds, and even the business side of music have changed so much that Paul sometimes feels like a stranger in a world he once helped build. Emotionally, Paul has described feeling disconnected from the modern industry. He often shares stories from his younger years with a mix of pride and sadness. He's nostalgic, but not in a cheerful way. He speaks about his greatest moments, like writing My Way for Sinatra or performing for sold-out crowds, knowing they're behind him now. In interviews and in his writing, he's expressed the feeling that, although fans still remember him, the industry itself has moved on. His personal life reflects many of the emotional challenges that come with aging. Though he still lives in comfort and remains physically active, Paul is largely on his own. He has very limited contact with some of his older children, and his circle of close friends has grown smaller over time. The loss of his longtime marriage, followed by a bitter second divorce and long custody battle, left deep marks on him emotionally. Despite these struggles, there is one strong and steady relationship in his life: his bond with his son, Ethan. Paul has full custody and is devoted to raising him. He's spoken about how much Ethan means to him and how that relationship gives him purpose. At a time when many of his past connections have faded, his role as a father to Ethan has kept him grounded. Health-wise, Paul has remained in relatively good shape for his age, but time has naturally slowed him down. He still values discipline and routine, and he works hard to stay well, both physically and mentally. However, the years have taken their toll. While he avoids dwelling on physical decline, he has mentioned how aging brings a different kind of loneliness. Although Paul Anka has left a huge mark on music, his name isn't often mentioned in modern music conversations. Today's artists rarely cite him as an influence. Award shows and tribute concerts frequently skip over his name. While fans from the 1950s through the 1980s still hold on to his legacy, younger generations know little about him. Even so, Paul Anka continues to live his life with dignity, reflecting on the highs and lows and staying close to the few people who still matter most to him. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Paul Anka's life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another music history story.